there are extensive delays and suspensions in train service because of a temporary loss of power.
The New York City subway is the circulatory system for the global capital of finance and media. And today, this 114-year-old engineering marvel is coming apart. Stalled trains, signal breakdowns, and constant line closures are complicating the lives of New Yorkers who ride the trains more than 5.5 million times a day. The MTA, the public agency that runs the subways, is woefully mismanaged, fiscally irresponsible, and politically captured. Thanks to the clout of the Transit Workers Union, subway workers on average make $155,000 in total annual compensation, or more than twice as much as the passengers they serve. The political response to this crisis has been mainly to devise new ways to collect more money for this troubled operation, such as a new millionaires tax or by imposing additional tolls and surcharges on cars. But a major lesson from the first 114 years of subway history is that giving the MTA more money from outside sources is like bringing an alcoholic to an open bar. The path to real reform and accountability is to make the subway live off its customers once and for all.
Subway riders should bear almost the full cost of the ride, with the exception of low-income folks where there's going to be some subsidy.
Baruch Feigenbaum is the Assistant Director of Transportation Policy at the Reason Foundation. A fare in New York City is a couple bucks and change. What would it be if it was more fully accounted?
So during rush hours, it would probably be at least $5 one way, and probably up to $8 or maybe even $10 based on how far the person is traveling. We charge what it takes to cover the cost, and then for folks who need the service, they would get a voucher or some sort of other discount so they can use it. We're not trying to subsidize upper middle class folks here.
One of the arguments against that is it's going to decrease economic activity overall because there is a positive externality to subsidizing people to come into Manhattan from the boroughs.
I really don't think $8 or $10 even is that much when you consider some of the other challenges in New York and people still live there. And the center of everything does not have to be Manhattan.
Is that the limit of transit policy, that people ride and pay the full cost?
That is the most efficient system. It's also the best system for the rider, because if the rider is the one paying the cost, then the transit agency is serving the rider. If Albany is bailing out the transit system, it's going to be whatever Albany wants.
Lately, whatever Albany wants has included budget items big and small that don't have any impact on service and reliability. And this is a theme that extends all the way back to the system's early days. The subway's troubles are deeply rooted in the decline of the fare as its primary revenue source.
Pushing here, pushing there, pushing everywhere. Here's what happens every day in the crowded old subway.
When the subway opened in 1904, it was 5 cents a ride, which was more than enough to finance operations. But when inflation eroded the value of a nickel, the city refused to permit fare increases. By 1920, 500 other U.S. cities had raised fares on their transit systems. Meanwhile, New York City's populist mayor John Hyland campaigned on the preservation of the nickel fare, calling it as sacred and binding as any contracts ever drawn in the history of financial transactions the world over. The fare did eventually go up, but not enough to keep pace with inflation, and the subway's revenue shortages became an endemic problem. Decades later, the city and state discovered a new way to plug up the shortfall, forcing drivers to pay for transit. In 1968, Governor Nelson Rockefeller orchestrated a backroom deal to reallocate revenues from 9 major bridges and tunnels to transit. Last year alone, drivers paid $1.1 billion in tolls that were diverted to subways and buses. The state created more hidden funding streams in the years that followed, and taxes and subsidies now comprise a larger share of the MTA's revenue than fares. These include a special sales, corporate, and payroll tax, and fees on real estate transfers, car rentals, driver's license renewals, and vehicle registrations. And the state just imposed a brand new surcharge on taxis and rideshares coming into Manhattan, with the money going to the MTA. These subsidies violate a central tenet of good transportation policy, which is to make each mode of travel self-sustaining. If fare subsidies were to come to an end, could the subway survive on its customers alone? It could in 1904 when the system opened, and it could in 1982 when the MTA studied the issue and journalist Peter Samuel wrote about it in Reason. The key is getting riders directly invested in slashing wasteful spending and reining in wildly inflated salaries by making them feel the horror, not just of signal malfunctions, train rerouting, and line closures, but that they've paid top dollar for the privilege of such dreadful service.
C trains are not running. We apologize for this inconvenience and we thank you for your patience.